so far that the blood vessels in his sclera began to rupture, turning his gaze into a mask of crimson agony. Tears of sheer shock poured down his temples, mixing with the sweat and dust of the cell. To a civilian doctor, the scene would be a violation of the Hippocratic Oath at its most fundamental level. But in the twisted ethical vacuum of Unit 731, performing a vivisection without anesthesia was considered a strict, uncompromising scientific necessity. General Ishii had drilled a specific dogma into his researchers. Anesthesia alters the normal physiological state of the human body. It lowers blood pressure, slows the heart rate, and relaxes the nervous system. If we use chemical sedatives, Ishii had lectured his staff during their orientation in Tokyo, the decomposition of the organs under the influence of the disease will be masked. The decomposition of the tissue must be observed in its pure, natural state. To sedate the Maruta is to distort the science. Yoshimura moved with a terrifyingly steady hand, ignoring the frantic thrashing of the legs secured to the table. He used surgical retractors to peel back the layers of skin and muscle, exposing the glistening cavity beneath. The assistant's pen scratched.
August 12th, 1940, 2:45 a.m. Operating Room 1, Block 7. The air in the room had grown heavy and humid. The prisoner's breathing was now a series of wet, shallow rasps. His nervous system, pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance, was beginning to misfire. His limbs twitched in erratic, rhythmic patterns known as the death dance by the more callous guards. Yet Dr. Yoshimura remained focused on the blackened, swollen lymph nodes. The necrosis is spreading faster than the 1939 trial suggested, Yoshimura observed, pointing with a bloodied probe. The tissue is darkening in real time. Fascinating. He reached for a pair of surgical scissors. With clinical efficiency, he began to sever the connections to the spleen. Every snip of the metal triggered a fresh jolt in the prisoner, whose muffled cries had faded into a low, rhythmic whimpering. To the researchers, this wasn't murder. It was dynamic pathology. They believed that by watching the organ function, seeing the blood pulse through the infected veins until the very moment of removal, they were gaining a pure understanding of the plague that would eventually be loaded into porcelain bombs and dropped on Chinese cities like Ningbo and Chengde. Once the organ was removed and dropped into a glass jar filled with preservative, the prisoner was no longer a log of any value. He was now an empty vessel. Subject's utility is exhausted, Yoshimura said, stepping back from the table. He didn't bother to stitch the wound. He didn't offer a final word or a look of pity. He simply stripped off his bloody gloves and tossed them into a bin. The medical assistant stepped forward, not with medicine, but with a syringe of air or a lethal dose of potassium chloride to finish the process. Though often the subjects were simply left to bleed out on the cold zinc while the doctors moved to the next.
August 1945. The flight from Pingfan. The end of Unit 731 did not arrive with a heroic siege or a dramatic courtroom reckoning. As the Soviet Red Army surged into Manchuria in the final weeks of World War II, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii issued a final, desperate command: destroy everything. The secret blocks were blown up with explosives. The remaining Maruta, hundreds of living witnesses to the horrors of the vivisections, frostbite experiments, and gas chambers, were systematically executed by poison or gunshot, their bodies thrown into mass pits and burned with gasoline. The researchers and doctors were handed vials of potassium cyanide, ordered to take their own lives if captured, and smuggled back to Japan on the last remaining transport trains. But Ishii and his inner circle had a final card to play. They didn't burn the data. They kept the meticulously typed ledgers, the thousands of slide samples of living tissue, and the gruesome photographs of the unanesthetized surgeries. When American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur took control of Japan, Ishii approached the military intelligence officers with a cold transactional offer: his research in exchange for total immunity from war crimes prosecution. The Americans looked at the data. They saw the detailed records of how the human body reacts to plague, anthrax, and trauma in conditions that no democratic nation could ever recreate. They realized that the information was priceless for their own burgeoning Cold War biological weapons program. The deal was struck in secret. October 1941. The inner sanctum of Block 7. The Pingfan complex was not just a prison, it was a highly specialized factory of death. Each block had a specific designation, and for the prisoners, the Maruta, being moved from one block to another usually signaled the final phase of their existence. Blocks 7 and 8, these were the prison wings, holding between 500 and 600 subjects at any given time. The cells were surprisingly clean, and the food was relatively high in calories. This wasn't out of mercy. Ishii demanded healthy subjects. A malnourished body would provide tainted data during a vivisection. The Frostbite Lab. Led by Hisato Yoshimura, this wing specialized in freezing the limbs of conscious prisoners. They were taken outside in sub-zero Manchurian temperatures, their arms dipped in water and left to freeze solid. Guards would strike the limbs with wooden clubs. If it sounded like a dry branch snapping, the freezing was complete. They were then brought inside for rewarming experiments, testing how the flesh sloughed off the bone when doused with boiling water versus room temperature water. In the center of this was the vivisection theater. Unlike a standard hospital, the theater was designed for observation from above. Junior officers and visiting dignitaries from Tokyo would watch from a glass-walled gallery as the logs were disassembled. The logistics of Unit 731 required a constant supply of human material. This was facilitated by the Kempitai, the Japanese military police. They developed a system known as Tokubetsu Goso, special delivery. When a Chinese partisan, a Russian escapee, or even a suspicious civilian was captured, the Kempitai didn't always put them on trial. Instead, they were marked for special delivery. These prisoners were transported in windowless black vans or shrouded train cars directly to the Pingfan gates. Once they passed the threshold, their legal existence ended. No records were sent back to their families. They were stripped, assigned a number, and fed into the machinery of the biological research wings. The doctors, many of whom were recruited from the 7 university peaks, Japan's elite medical schools, were told they were participating in a holy war of science. To keep morale high, Ishii provided the staff with luxuries, a swimming pool, a cinema, and high-quality rations. By day, they would peel the skin off a living subject to study gas gangrene. By night, they would listen to classical music and write letters home to their wives about the noble research they were conducting for the emperor.
The scale of the horror is difficult to quantify because of the mass destruction of evidence in 1945. However, estimates suggest that at least 3,000 men, women, and children died inside the walls of Pingfan. This does not include the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, who died in the surrounding villages when Unit 731 field-tested their weapons by dropping plague-infested grain and cotton from airplanes. I saw them take a woman and her child. They were used for a vacuum experiment. They wanted to see if the internal organs of a child reacted differently than an adult when the pressure was dropped. I will never forget the sound of the child's chest cavity collapsing while the mother watched. Testimony from a former Unit 731 medical assistant, given decades later. The tragedy of Unit 731 is doubled by the post-war silence. Because the American government prioritized scientific gain over justice, the specific horrors of the vivisection tables were largely suppressed until the late 1980s. The logs remained nameless, and the men who held the scalpels died as honored veterans, their crimes buried beneath the foundation of the modern global pharmaceutical and medical research industry.
July 18th, 1942, 3:14 a.m. Unit 643, a secret sub-branch of 731, Mudanjiang, Manchukuo. The main fortress at Pingfan was the brain, but Shiro Ishii's empire extended into dozens of secret satellite campuses hidden across the frozen borderlands of Manchuria. At Mudanjiang, the focus narrowed from grand warfare to the most intimate, harrowing limits of human reproduction and development under trauma. Inside the pristine nursery of the sub-branch, the sound was not the cold hum of machinery, but the soft,
irregular crying of an infant. The child was 3 months old, born inside the prison blocks to a Russian woman who had been infected with syphilis as part of a transplacental transmission study. The mother had already been taken to the vivisection theater weeks prior, dissected alive to observe the state of her uterus during the secondary stage of the disease. The infant was kept alive for a solitary purpose: to determine how a congenital disease ravages the nervous system of a developing child.
Dr. Minato, a pediatrician formerly with the Kyoto Imperial University, entered the room wearing thick leather boots and a sterile apron. He didn't look at the child with the warmth of a healer. He approached the crib with a silver tape measure and a set of calipers. Subject 412, Minato recorded, his voice flat. Infant male, manifesting visible signs of congenital neurosyphilis. Motor reflexes are severely retarded. To understand the progression of the disease without the interference of a dying metabolism, Minato ordered the child to be taken to the dissection room. The nurse, a young Japanese girl recruited from the rural prefectures under the promise of a noble civil service career, picked up the child. She had been conditioned by the Maruta philosophy. She did not see a baby. She saw a biological specimen that had reached its expiration date. The infant was laid on a small, custom-fitted copper tray on the main operating table. There was no leather restraint small enough, so the assistant simply held the child's tiny wrists down with his thumbs. Minato did not hesitate. He picked up a microscalpel. Without a drop of sedative, he made a clean, longitudinal cut down the center of the child's spine. The infant's cry was instantaneous, a piercing, high-frequency shriek that filled the tiled room and vibrated against the stainless steel sinks. Minato's hand remained perfectly steady. He used tiny silver clips to pin back the skin, exposing the delicate, translucent column of the infant's spinal cord. While the pathologists used scalpels, the chemists of Unit 731 used the glass spheres, massive, airtight, reinforced glass domes located in the subterranean levels of Block 7. Here, the researchers studied the weaponization of gases: phosgene, mustard gas, lewisite, and cyanide. The methodology was brutally simple,